It's amazing how much of our experience of a person or a place or a moment, for better or worse, is actually dependent on the way that they or it smells. And so I, part-time for the last 4 years, have been delivering pizzas for Domino's here in Eagle. And one of the side benefits is that my car always smells like pizza. So people get in and they're like, oh, your car smells like pizza. I know, isn't it amazing? I don't even need like a car air freshener because it's just permanent pizza smell. But when I was in 7th grade, me and several of my friends, we were hanging out with our youth pastor at his apartment. And at the end of it, we were all cleaning up, and one of the other kids, his name's Sergio, he's been a lifelong friend of mine, and he got the vacuum cleaner out, and he was vacuuming the floor, and what he didn't realize is that the youth pastor's dog had an accident in the corner, and Sergio accidentally vacuumed up that accident, and it was brutal. Now, I felt bad for my youth pastor because that's the kind of stuff they don't prepare you for when you go into ministry in Bible college, is that one of your students is going to vacuum up dog poop in your living room. But I cannot describe to you the mess that it made or the smell that filled their tiny little apartment when that fresh dog poop hit the warm motor in the vacuum cleaner. But you can imagine, okay? I don't want to get too graphic or gross. I know that's gross already. But even after it was all cleaned up, the smell in that apartment was horrible. And we opened the windows and we sprayed air freshener, but it took at least the rest of the afternoon to get that smell out of the apartment. On the other hand, is there anything better than walking into a place where somebody is baking fresh bread and you just go, oh my gosh, I got to get me some of that. Or somebody's barbecuing ribs, right? Isn't the aroma like intoxicating? It's amazing. The truth is that smells shape our everyday lives in a million different ways. Ever go to pour some milk and you do the sniff test just to make sure it's good? Or ever go to put on a pair of jeans and you do the sniff test just to make sure they're still good? Turns out if your milk smells funky or sour or spoiled, don't drink it. And if your jeans smell funky or sour or spoiled, don't wear them. Works for both. Or ever gone on a late night like fast food binge? I mean, none of us, but people or just kind of put your head in that space. Like maybe you did it, use your imagination, and then you get your order, and it somehow smells like both grease and shame. Like you're just like, I don't know that shame had a smell, but it smells like it. Or if you've raised teenagers, you ever open the door to their room and the aroma of puberty just comes wafting out, and it's like, I don't know what that is. I can't even identify that. Or how about that shot of happiness and dopamine you get when that first whiff of your favorite coffee shop hits you and you open the door? Or the smell of bacon or campfires or swimming pools or locker rooms or coconuts or garlic or the dump. If you play baseball or golf and you step out early that morning onto the first tee and the smell of fresh cut grass, oh man, it's great. It's the only good part of golf. I have no idea how to describe the way that my grandma's house smelled when I was a kid, other than it smelled like grandma smells. It just smelled like grandma stuff, right? So there's all these situations and more, all these things and more, all these people, all these experiences and more. And so, yeah, we get it. Smell is a huge part of our lives. There's a million different scents. There's a million different aromas that we encounter every day. But why in the heck would we talk about that right here, right now? What does any of that have to do with church or faith or God? So as you saw in the little bumper there that we've been in this series, as I mentioned earlier, called SENSELESS. And part of the truth of this series is this idea that faith is absolutely, there's no doubt about it, it's more than our five senses, but it's definitely not less than them. That faith, that following Jesus, that spirituality, because of the way that God created us, that it encompasses all of us. It's most definitely intellectual. It's most definitely emotional. It's obviously spiritual, but it's also physical. And so as it turns out, smells just don't shape our everyday lives. They're more spiritually important than you might think. Because what you may not realize is just how much God actually talks about scents and aromas and smells in the scriptures. And if you go all the way back to the beginning, in fact, to the beginning of our story in God, right? Like in Genesis chapter 2 is kind of where it begins. So for 6 days, when you go and begin to read in the beginning, in Genesis 1, you read all the creation, God is speaking and he's creating and he's taming and shaping the chaos, and lights are flashing and land is forming and life is beginning. But then late on the 6th day, after everything else is done, after all the animals are created, then God creates us. Only this time it's different. This time he changes his approach. This time he steps into the perfect paradise that he had just created, and he gets his hands dirty. He digs his hands into the earth, into the soil, kicking up dirt and dust, and he begins shaping humanity. And then look at what it says when he does that in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. It says, then he breathed the breath of life into the man's nostrils, and the man became a living person. Now, I don't know if you've ever had someone else's breath in your nostrils. You probably have. It is not an odor-free experience. See, before we looked in his eyes, before we heard his voice, before we felt his presence, we smelled the breath of our Creator. That it's actually what gave us life. It was the first thing that we ever experienced, ever. And so is it any wonder that the God who gave us life in this way would make scent and aroma a regular part of his ongoing conversation that he has with us? So let me just give you a few examples. In Exodus chapter 29, verse 18, God talks about how the roasting and burning of an animal as a sacrifice to him, aka barbecue. Okay, that wasn't the point of what they were doing, but that's what it smelled like. When you roast an animal, whether it's to eat it or to sacrifice it to a god, it smells the same. So God talks about the animal and that sacrifice and that experience and the aroma. He says that it's an aroma that's pleasing to him. In fact, in the books of Leviticus and Numbers, the phrase, a pleasing aroma to the Lord, is used 37 times to describe sacrifices. Isn't that odd? Why would God tell us his odor preferences? And so he says he likes the smell of the sacrifices. But then in Isaiah chapter 65, he says something different. God tells people that if they make the sacrifices and follow all of the religious rules, but they just keep doing whatever they want, that it's not a pleasing aroma. In fact, it's actually a stench. It's like an overpowering smoke that gets up in your nose and burns your nostrils. That's the way he describes it. In Ecclesiastes 10, it says that in the same way that a single dead fly would cause even the most beautiful perfume to stink, that your wisdom and honor can be polluted with just a little bit of stupidity and foolishness. In Ezekiel chapter 4, God tells Ezekiel to burn human sewage, human waste. And then he's supposed to bake some bread over that fire and eat it to show God's people how they look and smell to God and what their future holds. And Ezekiel's like, God, please don't make me do that. I don't want to have to do that. And God's like, okay, fine. You can burn some cow poop and do it over that instead, which is exactly what happens. I mean, I don't know what that smells like because I've never burned that before, but I don't imagine it's very good. In the New Testament, in Philippians chapter 4, verse 18, the generosity of early Christians is described as a fragrant or sweet-smelling sacrifice to God. In Ephesians 5, it describes the way that Jesus has loved us and gave his life for us as a sweet-smelling sacrifice, an aroma that's pleasing to God. There's no way around it when you read the scriptures. Smells are important to God, which honestly kind of hurts my brain a little bit to think about because God doesn't have a body like us. He doesn't have eyes and ears or a nose like we do, but he can see and hear and smell. And there's a particular way that he intended our lives to smell. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, in verse 14, it says, God helps us spread the knowledge about Christ everywhere like the smell of a perfume. In fact, God thinks of us as a perfume that brings Christ to everyone. What an interesting description of how God views the role of his people, of you and I. If you're a church person, if you're a person of faith, if you're a Christ follower, that's the way that the picture that God uses to describe us in terms of our relationship to the world around us. God thinks of us as a perfume, which is interesting because perfumes and oils played a significant role in the story, in the scriptures, in the story of God and us. And the first time we get a glimpse of it is all the way back toward the beginning of the Old Testament. Now, I want you to indulge me for just a minute because I'm going to get off into the weeds just a little bit, but there's something here, I promise. Because this is a place where God uses tangible experiences in our material reality to point us to a spiritual truth. And so in Exodus chapter 30, God is giving instructions for the tabernacle and the altar and all the physical places of worship and everything that's going on when people would show up basically to church, show up at the tabernacle to worship God. And then he gives instructions for the priests and the Levites and their rhythms and their rituals and all of their responsibilities. But then because smells are so important to him, he actually gives specific directions and even detailed recipes for all of the holy oils and perfumes and incense that's going to be used inside the temple. And so he tells them to burn incense at the altar, and that the smoke that's rising up from the burning of that incense actually represents the prayers of people going up to God. So that when people prayed, there was not only something tangible that they could see, but there was also this aroma because of the incense that they're burning, because of how he had them create that incense. And so God's people, their prayers, they had a smell. And God had in mind a very specific aroma when he gave that to them. He has them start with all this sweet stuff, cane and calamus and frankincense. And then to the sweet, he added salt and cinnamon and other savory and delicious spices. But then he does something unexpected. He has them cut the overwhelming richness of all of that with something bitter, something like myrrh, something altogether different, something from some gum resin. And so the incense and the oils, they were all bitter and sweet. And so the result when they combined them together was something full and textured and nuanced and strong and beautiful. And listen, I don't want you to miss this because these were physical incenses, physical oils, but the imagery is unmistakable. See, when it comes to life, I don't know about you, but I just want the sweet. Yeah, okay, sure. Maybe throw in some of the savory in there too. That's cool. That sounds good. But bitter? No thanks. I don't want any of that stuff. The problem is, without the bitter, the sweet isn't fit for consumption. And that's not just true in fragrances. That's not just true in foods. That's also true in life. Because a life of nothing but sweetness rots your body and your soul. See, the truth is, it's often the elements, the things that are overpowering, the things that leave a bad taste in your mouth, or the things that make your nose hairs curl, the things that make your eyes water a little bit and kind of recoil. They're actually essential ingredients in the recipe of your life. If you've ever, my wife loves making chocolate chip cookies for people. Have you ever baked, or if you're a guy, you've ever made your own dry rub, you're putting it together. When you take all of the individual ingredients, right, if you just decided, like if you took a cookie and you're just like, I'm going to eat all of the parts of this separately, you would be very disappointed, right? But when you put them all together, it's something incredible. See, those sour, those bitter moments, experiences in our lives, they're actually essential ingredients in the recipe that God is putting together and pulling together as he's growing your life. Every ingredient in the mix of your life has been intentionally selected by God, and he blends the bitter and the sweet, combining and mixing them together to create something full and textured and deep and strong and beautiful of your life. But there's also something else going on here, though, because the oils and perfumes that God had him create, they weren't for him. They were actually for the people. And here's what I mean. I think one of the reasons that God ties so many faith practices, so many faith experiences to smells in the scriptures is because of the powerful role that they play in creating memories for us. And you probably know this, but medical science tells us that while all of our senses have a hand in how we form and recall memories, smells are often the biggest factor. And that's because of the way that your brain tries to make sense of or process whatever it is that you're smelling. While information from all of your other senses and things that you see and hear and touch and taste, that information almost always gets processed in more logical parts of your brain first. Odors and aromas don't. Odors and aromas, the way your brain takes them in, they almost immediately go to your limbic system, which processes and regulates your emotions and your memories. And so when your brain is storing a memory, it combines smells and emotions into one thing. And that's why phrases like you could smell the shame or he reeked of arrogance, like, makes sense to us. We understand that they're metaphors, we get that, but we can also imagine how that would smell based on our own experiences and our own memories. It's also why certain smells don't just make us think of specific things, but they also make us feel specific ways, for better or for worse. It's why, like, when you first move out and leave home, why a certain kind of dryer sheet can make you miss your mom, right? Or a certain cologne makes you feel like you're an 8-year-old kid again looking up to your dad. Hansi has such positive emotions and memories connected to sunscreen that when I put on sunscreen, she wants to make out. And so if you ever smell me wearing sunscreen, y'all know what's up, all right? So when we were in high school and young adults, so we met in junior high school. We've been together since I was 12 and spent most of our lives together. But when we were in high school and young adults, she was in and out of hospitals for several years. She had multiple brain surgeries. She has cysts and tumors removed. She had epilepsy. Ultimately, she had a right temporal lobectomy where they removed kind of the front forward chunk of the right side of her head. It was horrible. The whole process was a couple of years. It was grueling. It was scary. It was painful. Her life was in doubt a couple of different times, and certainly the quality of her life was in doubt the whole time. And so to this day, every time I walk into a hospital, I'm right back in that room 30 years ago. All of those experiences, just as powerful and potent as real as the day that I lived them. Because scents mark moments. They just do. And I think this is a huge part of what God is doing with his people in these places in the scriptures. He's trying to get them to form memories that will anchor their lives to him, to mark specific moments with specific scents and aromas so that every time they smell them, boom, it triggers a truth that they need to get back towards, to move towards, to hold on to. Because there were moments when they needed God and he showed up and he came through and he rescued and he guided and provided for them. But then 5 minutes later, like us, they acted like it was like it never happened. Isn't it amazing how easily we forget the things we should remember and remember a whole bunch of things that aren't worth remembering at all? We should just forget them. Football stats. Who needs that? It's on lockdown here. Your kids' names, it's a little iffy. But no matter how spiritual we are, we tend to drift in the direction of thinking that what's true and what's real is what can be experienced or explained by our senses, even when our faith tells us that's not the case, even when we know. We can't help it but look and go, God, I know this is true, but I feel this because this is the way my life is. We're prone to trust our senses, and so God brilliantly leverages them to help us connect with him and to trust him. So there's this other really important story about oils and perfumes, and it takes place in the New Testament in the life of Jesus. It's found in Matthew chapter 26. Beginning with verse 6, it says this. It says, while Jesus was in Bethany in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. Why this waste, they asked. This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor. Don't you love when people who are like, have never had anything to do with the poor are all of a sudden like advocates about what you should do with your stuff when it comes to the poor, not just the poor, anything. Verse 10. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, why are you bothering this woman? She's done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Okay, so Jesus is a dinner guest. He's having dinner at the home of a guy named Simon the leper, which means two things we know about Simon. Number one, he had at some point had leprosy. And if you had leprosy in this culture, that meant that you had to live outside the city. You were an outcast because they didn't want anybody to get it from you. And so you had to live away. You had to go away. Anytime somebody approached, you had to yell out, I'm a leper, stay away, don't come near me. It also tells us that he'd been healed because now he's living in the city, he's got a home, and he's hosting dinner parties. So at some point, he had leprosy, and at some point, he was healed. And by the way, aren't you glad that we don't get publicly labeled with the most broken parts of our stories? Like, hey, where'd you guys go Friday night? Oh, we had dinner over at Jim the adulterer's house. Oh, cool. Who was all there? You know, Tammy the drunk and Joe the liar and Jenny the outcast and the greedy Smiths. They were there. It was great. We played games and talked. So Jesus is there having dinner, and right in the middle of dinner, there's an unexpected essential oils presentation that breaks out, which is, I think, how most essential oil presentations happen. I think that's in the doTERRA playbook. You got to just spring it on them, invite them to dinner and spring it on them. Only this lady doesn't know what she's doing. You're not dabbing it and putting it behind the ears. She's just like, I'm just going to dump this whole thing on you. This is our new blend of frankincense and myrrh. It will heal cancer, take care of your allergies, gets rid of germs. What we do know is this unnamed woman comes in with a full jar of very expensive perfume, and she pours it all over Jesus. And so it's obvious right out of the gate, right from the beginning in the story, that this story is actually a story about smell, or at least partially. I mean, how can it not be? She poured an entire jar of perfume on Jesus in the middle of a dinner party. I mean, think about how strong and overpowering that would be. Have you ever met a middle schooler who just got their first bottle of Axe body spray? Okay, this is bigger than that. It's worse than that. And what's interesting to me, though, is how the disciples respond. Because it says that they're indignant. They're offended. To them, this was a giant waste. It was a missed opportunity. See, anytime you actually begin to move towards a life of courage, because think about the courage that this took for this woman to do it. Anytime you move towards a life of courage and sacrifice, there will always be people standing on the sidelines going, what are you doing? That's a waste. Why are you doing that? And oftentimes it includes people that you thought would be on your side. It includes people you thought would be cheering you along. And sometimes it especially includes those people. Taking action will always upset people who are just content to sort of passively observe. Because your sacrifice will make them feel like, oh man, maybe we should have been doing something extravagant or sacrificial too. And they don't want to. And so rather than looking in the mirror and going, hey, we should have been doing, why don't we do something? What should we do? How can we sacrifice? And it's so much easier to just be indignant. And so they say it's unnecessary, it's a waste. But do it anyway. See, following Jesus isn't about believing something. It's not just about believing something. It's about becoming someone. Isn't it weird that what smelled like a waste to the disciples smelled like worship to Jesus? Wow. Same moment, same experience, same bottle of perfume. That's a waste. By the way, what the disciples said, it wasn't that unreasonable. But can I just tell you, faith isn't always reasonable. Of course, use your head. Of course, use your intellect and intelligence and the brain that God gave you. Live with wisdom. But you will never be able to get where God wants to take you in your faith or in your life without sacrifice that looks and feels to everybody else as being unreasonable. And by definition, that means that there are things that God will lead you to do that won't make any sense on the outside. Do them anyway. And so Jesus responds and he defends her. And then he says something that I really want you to see, I want you to think about. He says, when she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. So a little backstory on the customs in the New Testament in this part of the world. When somebody died, they had a very specific set of practices and rituals that they walked through to prepare the body for burial. And so they would wash the body clean, and as part of the process for preparing the body to be buried, they would dump perfume all over it to cover the smell as the body began to decompose. And what that would do is it allowed the family and friends time to mourn the loss of their loved one before they were buried without everybody being like, oh my gosh, what is that horrible smell? But they didn't use just any run-of-the-mill perfume. They almost always used nard oil. See, nard was way too expensive for everybody to just use it every day in all kinds of different ways. And so most of the time it was saved specifically for burial. And in Mark's version of this same story, Mark tells this same story in Mark 14. Mark actually tells us that what was in the jar that she dumped on his head was nard oil. Here's the problem. It was used on dead people. You dump it on somebody after they die. But Jesus isn't dead. He's very much alive. And remember, she wasn't just like, here, let's dab this on you. No, she poured the whole jar on him. This is something it wouldn't have washed off easily. It wouldn't have worn off easily. So yeah, everywhere Jesus went after that, people would have definitely noticed, like, holy cow, that dude likes a lot of cologne. So Jesus lived the last week of his life leading up to his crucifixion covered in the beautiful scent of death. The smell that everybody would have been like, that's what they used on my Uncle Jimmy when he died. Right? That's what they used on my cousin when he passed away. This is what gets used. This is what gets smelled. And so this new reality begins taking shape for Jesus' followers, for everybody who's living around him. They're listening to him talk about his sacrifice and laying down his life for them, that he is going to be this living, breathing sacrifice. This idea that had never existed before in anybody's mind. What had once only been the smell of burial would come to be the scent of resurrection. And given everything we know about smells and associations, about scent and memory, I can't help but wonder if God in his genius wasn't using the nature of this lady's sacrifice to anchor his disciples to the memories of his final week. That what the disciples saw as a waste was the very thing that God somehow used to lock in for them all of the most important moments from the most important week of the most important man who ever lived. I can't help but wonder that. I also can't help but wonder what it might look like for you and I to begin to be more intentional about attaching scents or aromas or smells to moments, experiences, truths, realities that we can't afford or don't want to forget. We already do this accidentally in our culture. And there's things that you can smell and you're just like, it's time for Christmas, right? What if we actually began to do this, though, intentionally in some way around our faith? So I grew up in faith traditions that weren't super traditional. And so I never once in my childhood, all growing up, attended a church where they had an Ash Wednesday service. But when we went to plant our first church, we were partnering with this organization that was a little bit different in the way that they expressed their faith and definitely a little bit more traditional. And so we were at a training and we just happened to be there during Holy Week. And that Wednesday, there were all the people who were being trained. We all went to a service together. I was like, I'm 32 years old. I'm about to go to my first Ash Wednesday service. And I was not prepared. I mean, I knew what Ash Wednesday was. I knew all the events of Holy Week. I was not prepared for how powerful and beautiful and stunning that service was. But what I will never forget is the moment when the little cross on my forehead, like the smell of the ash in the water together. I'll never forget that. And so now every single year when Ash Wednesday rolls around, I have this moment that's triggered for me and all of the incredible, beautiful things that God spoke into my life during the course of that service simply because of a scent. I don't know. Maybe it's all just crazy. Maybe it's all just coincidence, or maybe God knows exactly what he's doing. Maybe that's why Jesus said what he said about the lady in the story, that wherever his story was going to be told, her story would be told as well. Maybe what she did wasn't a waste. Maybe what she did wasn't just a singular act of worship. Maybe what she did was part of the reason that you and I actually know the story of Jesus at all. A few minutes ago, I mentioned a scripture in Ephesians chapter 5, and I actually want to read it with you. The first couple of verses in Ephesians 5 say this: imitate God in everything. Imitate God in, think about that in your life. Imitate God in everything you do, because you are his dear, loved, beloved children. Live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. And then here's what I quoted to you a few minutes ago, that he loved us and offered himself as a sacrifice for us, a pleasing aroma to God. He says, follow the example of Jesus, meaning our lives ought to smell like love, and love always smells like sacrifice. Well, what does sacrifice smell? You want to know what sacrificial love smells like? It smells like a meal that you're driving across town for somebody you barely know, but because they're struggling, you're helping them out. It smells like diapers and Play-Doh and crayons of all the people that serve in our kids' ministry. It smells like leaves and grass and fall when we serve together every fall during Rake Up Boise, helping people who can't take care of their yards. It smells like the senior center where you volunteer. It smells like the cookies you baked your neighbor. I mean, you think about your life, almost all the scents, all the smells that you feel sentimental about somehow point to sacrifice. They're the good memories about what somebody did for you, or made for you, or built for you, or cooked for you, or how they just showed up for you. And in these verses in Ephesians 5, the Apostle Paul's going, if you're a Jesus follower, that's what God wants us to do. Imitate him. That's what our life should look like. Because when you needed him, he showed up and he came through and he rescued you and he guided you and he provided for you. And so we respond by showing up and loving people sacrificially in our lives every day. And when we do that, God's like, that is the perfume, that's the scent that I want going out into the world when people think about what my followers are like. And so the question I have for you this week, the question I want you to wrestle with in your own life is, what's one way that you can imitate God this week? Practically. Not just be like, oh, that was really good, I'm going to think about that. No. What is one way? Not 10, not 5, not 3. What's one way that you can imitate God in your relationships, at your workplace, in your neighborhood, online? Good God, we need way more of us who are willing to imitate God online.
Church, I just want to take a moment and say thank you for watching our service online. Whether you're watching it for the first time or you're watching it again because you enjoyed the service so much from the weekend, I'd like to take a moment and dive into our giving. Every week we give people the opportunity to give back and give to the local church so that God can continue to bless your lives and bless your finances. Here at South Hills, we believe that everything comes from God. We believe that he's the one that chose us and brought us into this world, gave us our gifts and talents and abilities. And I just want you to know that when we give, we are giving back what God has already given to us. If you've ever seen any of our envelopes at a South Hills campus, you'll see on there that it says, every week at South Hills, your generosity is giving people the opportunity to live a better story. And there's a scripture on there in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21 that says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So I want to encourage you today to click down below and set up your giving, whether it's for the first time or whether you're doing reoccurring giving. We have 4 ways to give here at South Hills. 1, you can do it in person at any of our campuses through an envelope. Or 2, you can actually text any amount that you would like to 84321. And the 3rd way is to download our Church Center app. I encourage you to do this one because the Church Center app gives you opportunity to stay connected with our church and your campuses. It's a great tool and resource for you to know what's going on. And the 4th way to give is to give online. You can go to southhills.org/give and you can set up your giving there. Whether you're a guest of our church or whether you are a member of our church, or whether you simply just like to watch our services, I encourage you to trust God with your finances so that he can bless and anoint your finances and you can be trusting God in this journey of living life to the fullest. I love you and thank you for watching our online service today.